Hey guys, how's it going? So I hope you're having a good day today, and I hope all is going well with you. So for today's video, we're going to do another radio story. And for today's radio story, we're going to talk about 93.9 FM in Windsor, Ontario. And we're going to talk about the various formats they went through and the seemingly identity crisis they had during the 1980s and early 1990s. So in recent years, they've actually found, for the most part, some stability, but it wasn't always that way. So we'll start from the beginning. So 93.9 signed on as CKLW-FM in the mid to late 1960s. They were a sister station to, of course, AM 800, CKLW. Now, CKLW AM 800 was a very popular station, both on the American side and on the Canadian side. And AM 800 has a really powerful signal. I mean, you can hear CKLW in most of northern Ohio, in southeast Michigan, actually in a good chunk of Michigan, and then, of course, nearly all of southern Ontario. So anyway, 93.9 FM at first kind of had... it was kind of a hybrid between like beautiful music and a simulcast of AM 800. I believe they would change it up in day parts. Like, I think like in the key parts of the day, they would simulcast CKLW AM. And then I think other parts of the day, they had a different format, like an MOR or middle of the road format. And AM 800 and 93.9 were owned by RKO, which was an American company, that was kind of a subsidiary of their record label, because I think RKO had a lot of artists. I believe they had a lot of disco artists in the 70s, but they had a lot of, pop music acts. So the Canadian government passed a law, I believe this was around 1972 or so, that declared that all radio stations must be Canadian owned and cannot be foreign owned. And this was under the Trudeau government, the first Trudeau, the Pierre Trudeau. Also, this new law stipulated CanCon content, which meant that I believe like every hour so many Canadian artists needed to be played. I believe it was 25% to 30%. So RKO was forced to sell CKLW AM and FM, and a company called Batten Broadcasting purchased CKLW AM and FM. CKLW-FM flipped away from the hybrid format, the MOR, and then some parts of the day simulcast of AM 800, to a country format. And they had the country format for a few years. And it was actually Southern Ontario and Southeast Michigan's first FM country station. But it wasn't all that successful, because most country listeners were still listening to the AM for the most part. Like you had WCXI on 1130, and you had a couple of other stations, that AM stations, that were doing country at the time. So the country listeners really didn't migrate over to the FM, and the ratings weren't really that good either on the Detroit side or on the Canadian side. So the station switched to a adult standards big band format, and they had that for a number of years. Now, for some reason or another, and I'm not sure why this is, but in I think it was around 1981, 1982, 93.9 changed their call letters to CKJY. And I don't know if that was to differentiate itself from AM 800 or what have you, but the standards format went on for a couple more years after the call letter change. Now here's where things get really, really, really interesting. Okay, so by about 1983, 1984, it was becoming clear that top 40 music's days on the AM were coming to a close. There were a couple of stations in Detroit that had flipped to a top 40 format, which of course was 96.3 in Detroit, and for a time 99.5 WABX when they flipped away from rock to rock top 40. And this left AM 800 CKLW in a bit of a bind because many cars by this time had FM radios in them. And a lot of people had FM radios in their house, or, you know, they had a stereo system that had an FM radio. And CKLW AM sort of became... it kind of became second banana. It was like the station that you would turn on when you didn't like a song that 96.3 or that 99.5 was playing. So this caused AM's ratings to take a nosedive. And Banton started to realize this, that they were going to, if they wanted the top 40 format to survive, they were going to have to go to the FM. So they hatched a plan. And the plan was to eventually move the adult standards format to the AM, to AM 800, and to flip 93.9 to a top 40 station to compete with 96.3 FM mainly. Well, things got off to a rocky start. Now, they had really big plans for 93.9 FM. At this time they switched the call letters from CKJY to CFXX. And the station was to be known as 94 Fox FM. And they, for a little while, they had really took their time to put this format together. And, you know, give the station an updated image for the 1980s. And, you know, they had put together a station liner package, playlists. I mean, they were just getting everything together. It was set. It was ready to go. Then the CRTC stepped in. And remember, if you watched my history of 88.7 FM, you'll know what the how fussy the CRTC was. Now, of course, if you don't know, the CRTC is like the Canadian version of the FCC. Well, the CRTC told them, well, we're going to approve the format change. And if you remember that format changes have to be approved through the CRTC in Canada. They said, we'll approve the format change, but we'll only let you do 2 day parts for 2 hours. And the rest of the hours of the day have to remain adult standards. So I believe they had an afternoon day part and an evening day part, if I'm not mistaken. So they did this at first with the hope that the CRTC would change its mind and let the station go full time. And after some time, this clearly wasn't going to happen. And obviously, everybody was extremely disappointed. The CRTC's reason was that that more refined music belongs on the FM and pop music, rock music belongs on the AM, which just seems asinine to me. I mean, even by 1980s standards. And another thing that I found interesting was the choice of call letters. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if I've ever seen any Canadian calls with X in them. Now, with Canadian call letters, the second letter, they only use a few letters for the second letter, like CB, CF, CK, and there's a CI, and there's a few others. But with X in the call sign anywhere, that's pretty rare. So they kind of threw in the towel on the Fox project. Now, at this time, Batten sold the station to CUC Broadcasting. And CUC, I believe, was mainly did cable TV, but they dabbled in radio a little bit. So AM 800 and 93.9 were sold to CUC. CUC switched 93.9's call letters to CKEZ, and they became an easy listening station. But this would not last for long. So around this time as well, they switched. What happened was on AM 800, they finally threw in the towel on Top 40 and switched AM 800 to an adult standards format. Now, with 93.9 FM, in 1986, they flipped the station to oldies, and they reacquired the call letter CKLW, so CKLW FM. And the idea was that they brought back the format that was heard on AM 800, but what they did was they retooled it into an oldie station to capture the sound of CKLW back in the 1960s and early 1970s. And they would play The Good Times Are Back, and then, they did the jingle CKLW, the Motor City. And they brought back the liners and even what was called 2020 News. And, they really thought that they had something. CKLW FM did attract a small but loyal audience, but for some reason the station just did not click on the American side of the border. And I think the reason possibly why is because, again, they were saddled with CanCon content. And that would be groups and, solo musicians that weren't popular on the American side or never quite cracked the American market. So I think that's what some of the problem was. And also on the Detroit side, you had Solid Gold Kiss 102.7 FM. And despite 102.7's spotty signal, Solid Gold was pretty popular. So I think that was some of the other reason why the CKLW format failed. Well, what they did was they basically kept the oldies format, but they retooled it a bit, and they changed the name to More 94, and they switched the call letters to CKMR. More 94 lasted for about 3 years or so, but again, they just were not having much luck with the station and not having any luck on the American side of the border, despite the fact that they ran commercials, television commercials on the American side of the border on Detroit TV stations. So 93.9 at this point made an extremely weird move. So they changed the call letters back to CKLW, and they flipped to a urban-based format, if you can believe it. It was urban-based music to compete with 92.3 WMXD on the American side. And this was a really peculiar format to have on a Canadian station, because to make this format work, again, you have to satisfy CanCon content. And this is a little tricky to be, and I'm just being honest, there's not a lot of urban-based artists that are Canadian. I imagine that you would have had to have played I mean, the only thing that I could think of that would probably fit the format really well would have been some of Gino Vannelli's music. But again, you know, that's really a hard fit. Well, the urban format proved to be a bit of a challenge, too much of a challenge, because within months they abandoned the format. And the urban format was, I almost forgot this, the urban format was known as I-94. Well, after throwing the towel in on the urban format, they shifted the station towards more of a top four, or more of like an adult top 40, sort of an adult contemporary kind of sound. Maybe basically a hot AC format. And I believe they were still using the name I-94, but that didn't work out either. So what they did, and I believe this was around sometime in 1992, because the urban format and the AC format were in 1991, they decided to take another shot at oldies, and they flipped back to oldies as CKLW, bringing back sort of the classic CKLW sound of the 60s and early 70s that was originally heard on AM 800, except they were calling it the Legend. I think they used the name 93.9 The Legend. And, you know, again, it attracted a loyal audience. But by this time, you know, 93.9 was changing formats so much that I think just a lot of people just tuned out. And also, you have to kind of remember, too, if you know about Detroit radio, is that 104.3 WOMC had flipped to oldies a couple years prior to this. And WOMC became very popular in the market. So CKLW just couldn't compete with that. And let's face it, the audience just moved on. So what they did was by about, I would say probably by about mid-1993 or so, they flipped to a classic rock format, sort of like a 70s based classic rock format, like that was a bit more on the mellow side. So basically nearly a carbon copy of WCSX is kind of what they were doing, but maybe just more with a classic hits lean to it. And you know, that literally did nothing. In fact, I think it made the ratings worse, to tell you the truth. Well, in 1994, I believe this was sometime in about mid to late 1994 or so, they took on a new format. And around this time, 93.9, as well as AM 800 were sold to the Chum Group, which owned 88.7, which was of course 89X, and 580 CKWW. Now, by this time, 89X was extremely popular in the Detroit market and on the Canadian side in southern Ontario. So what they did was they flipped 93.9 to adult album alternative to kind of complement 89X. And adult album alternative wasn't exactly a brand new format, but it was a format that was just not done very much. And it was a format that was definitely not being done in Southeast Michigan or in Southern Ontario. So they flipped to the River. And the River became pretty popular, actually, throughout the rest of the 90s. And they never had a huge audience, but they did have a very loyal audience, and they did definitely make a dent. And they did a lot better than their prior formats did. And it's funny, just as a side note, I remember actually how I discovered the River, actually, funny enough. It was actually funny because my parents were actually having a house built at this time, and the guys working on the house were listening to this River station, and, you know, it's like, whoa, wow, what is this? And, yeah, so the River was fairly popular throughout the rest of the 90s. And then, you know, they flipped to adult contemporary in 2000, and then to hot AC in the mid 2000s, flipped back to the river, and then today they are known as 93.9 Virgin Radio. But yeah, 93.9 just couldn't make up their mind what they wanted to do in the late 80s and early 90s. So it was kind of an interesting situation, to say the least. So that concludes this radio story. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. And as always, guys, have a great rest of your day.